Farmer was tired of people illegally parking on his land and got revenge. It's no secret that running a farm is one of the hardest jobs out there. It means early mornings and manual labor under the sun, day in and day out. So when people continue to ignore a farmer's plea to stop illegally parking on his land, he decided to take matters into his own hands. By that point, he was done trying to do things the nice way and needed to start teaching people a lesson. This eventually led to the police showing up. But did they side with him? Deval Betakovic is the owner of a farm that thoughtless people assumed they could use as a parking lot. He's depended on his land and its mineral-rich soil for some time, but once a week, everything he works hard for is threatened. Betakovic is a humble man and would rather not draw attention to himself or his land. However, a viral video taken of what he did to stop people from parking on his land changed his life for the better. Ever since Betakovic's village of Jekusevac became integrated with the town of Zagreb in Croatia, countless Zagreb residents would come into the area for the weekly flea market. Now a part of the Zagreb municipality, the once small town now has an overflow of people on a weekly basis looking to score a deal on what many people might think is junk. While some residents saw it as a way to make a quick buck, farmers like Betakovic were not thrilled whatsoever. Since there were so many visitors coming to Jekusevac to check out the flea market, that meant that the town had to deal with a lot of cars, far too many of them. Unsurprisingly, there just wasn't enough space to park in the provided area for the market, so people began to park wherever they wanted. Unfortunately, Betakovic's farm was just across the street, so it became a prime parking area once the main lot had filled up. Before Betakovic ever owned the farm near Zagreb, and before Zagreb even existed, the land was controlled by various different civilizations, beginning with the Romans. Zagreb is made up of several different settlements in the area, making it the largest Croatian city by the 19th century. When Yugoslavia fell after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Croatia declared independence in 1991, leading to Betakovic's village becoming integrated into the Zagreb municipality. However, not everyone was keen on the idea. Because Betakovic's land is so large, it seemed like an obvious choice for people to park their cars there. Most people thought there wasn't anything harmful being done by parking for just a few hours, especially if other people were doing it. However, Betakovic had made it clear time and time again that he didn't appreciate the shoppers parking on his farmland every Sunday. Although most people only see cars as a danger when they're moving, that certainly wasn't the case for Betakovic. After the video of Betakovic's revenge went viral on the internet, there was some backlash from people who claimed that he went too far. While trespassing for a short period of time on a small part of Betakovic's vast amount of land might not be the worst thing, leaving their vehicles behind is. This is because when cars are parked after they've been running, they can release a lot of chemicals into the earth that will ruin fertile soil. Since Betakovic is a farmer, his life depends on the quality of his soil and the crops that he produces from it. Betakovic already had enough to worry about before people started parking on his farm, considering that his neighborhood is also home to one of the biggest landfills in Zagreb. Although strides have been taken to minimize the damage the landfill might have on his soil, according to the EPA, the waste will affect it eventually. However, the trash wasn't the biggest problem. One of the greatest threats to the soil around the landfills is leachate, a liquid that forms when rainwater trickles through all the waste. As the water filters through the trash, it absorbs toxins such as methane, carbon dioxide, acids, and more, all of which are extremely dangerous. When this toxic liquid makes its way back into the earth, it taints the groundwater and soil deep underground. For farmers, that means that the water can poison their crops and make it so their soil can't grow anything. Because his crops were at risk because of the landfill nearby, the last thing that he needed was people parking on top of his already threatened land and getting their car fluids seep into the ground. At first, he tried to be polite and inform people of the problem, but it seemed to have the opposite effect. Instead, more and more people were parking on his property, more than likely further damaging his precious soil. A video that was recorded of the situation showed Betakovic's property with cars parked in 2 rows like they were every single Sunday. Then Bedakovic appears ready to exact his revenge on the people poisoning his land, something he's been patiently waiting to do. However, he wasn't completely malicious when doling out his revenge. While he could have slashed their tires or had their cars towed away, he did something that's more than appropriate for the situation. After asking people politely not to park on his property again and again, Bedakovic knew that it was time to take action. So he hopped into his red tractor, put the keys in the ignition, and got to business. He had plans to plow his fields, but this time it wasn't to plant a new crop. As people stared at him in confusion, he continued to plow in front of the lines of cars on his property. People thought he was crazy for working on a Sunday, but little did they know what he was actually doing. For the most part, people went about their business. It didn't seem all that strange for a farmer to be plowing his field, even if it was on a Sunday. He made sure to do a good job too, going back and forth, making sure that the land was nice and turned. However, eventually people began to stop and stare, and it wasn't because he was doing an excellent job plowing. People started to realize that something else was going on at Bedakovic's farm. After some people came back from the market and got into their cars to drive home, Bedakovic's plan became clear. He had turned the soil so much that the ground was no longer drivable. Everyone's car was stuck in the tilled earth while Bedakovic stood there smiling. No one who parked their car on his property regularly ever imagined they wouldn't be able to get out. However, not everyone was as satisfied as Bedakovic. Many began to complain, and it wasn't long until the police arrived. When police first arrived on the scene, they were confused to see all the cars trapped in the freshly plowed fields. Having a lot of questions, they approached Bedakovic, who was sitting on his tractor. In normal circumstances, Bedakovic could have been charged with obstruction of traffic, but this was no normal situation. Yes, the land was Bedakovic's property, but customers of the market needed somewhere to park in order to help sustain the town's economy. It was time for the police to have a word with Bedakovic. After speaking with Bedakovic, police came to the conclusion that he'd done nothing wrong whatsoever. Although it may have been inconveniencing for the people whose cars were stuck, he was well within his rights. The people had parked on his land without permission, and he has the right to plow his fields whenever he wants to. On top of that, he also has the right to protect what's his, especially if it's his livelihood. After their conversation, the police left the scene without even giving Bedakovic a warning. One woman in a silver Peugeot battled with her car to get it back onto the main road. She moved forward, reversed, went left, went right, but nothing seemed to be working. At first, it looked like she might have been able to get out without much effort, but the closer she got to the road, the more stuck her car became. At one point, one of the officers had to get behind the wheel and try to get the car out of Bedakovic's trap. It was clear that Bedakovic had made his point. The woman's car was completely stuck, and not even the police could manage to get it out. So, confident that the woman had learned her lesson, he decided to show her mercy. He brought the tractor back out and flattened the land around her car so she could get back on the road. One thing was sure, the woman would never park on his land again. After the incident, videos taken of what Bedakovic had done started going viral, especially on YouTube. One YouTube user praised him for his efforts, commenting, "People are just so selfish sometimes. Good that you taught them a lesson." Some criticized him, saying that he should have posted a sign or that the people couldn't have possibly known that it was farmland. Yet the vast majority of people sided with Bedakovic and commended him for protecting his land in a peaceful manner as he did. Some people also thought of another idea. Some YouTube viewers suggested that he could have used the opportunity to make a little side money. One person commented, "Sorry, but he should have just let them park, cordoned off the area, and then charged $100 for the parking. Heck, he could have put chains on their tires or something." Although this is an option, simply parking on the property wasn't the main issue. It was the damage that it could have done to his crops. One sympathetic YouTuber wrote, "For those advocating the parking, just think rationally for 1 second. These cars are ruining the aggregate of the soil, and the toxins from the car can leach into the ground. With the landfill so close to his land, Bedakovic already had enough to worry about. The last thing he needed was cars damaging his land further every Sunday, leaving behind their toxins that would harm the property even further." Some even believe that those who had parked illegally should have faced the consequences of the law. As much bad luck as this farmer had, one comedian faced his own rude dilemma at an airport that he felt needed to be handled. Keep watching to find out what heinous act was committed and how he got his revenge. Have you ever run into a rude person at the airport? Most of us have. In 2017, comedian Steve Hofstetter encountered the rudest airport attendee of all time. He was so frustrated that he decided to enact revenge. Steve posted his entire story on the Pro Revenge subreddit and later on Facebook, where both posts quickly went viral. He claims that he may have gone too far, but did he? You can decide after hearing the entire story. It all started with a dog doing its business. Steve recounts that he was at Los Angeles International Airport, LAX, when this all went down. He was walking to his terminal when he spotted a woman loudly FaceTiming on the phone. But that wasn't what kept him staring. The woman's dog was squatting and taking a dump right on the terminal floor. Not only was that gross, but it demonstrated a lack of etiquette on the owner's behalf. And did she clean it up? No, of course she didn't. Steve wasn't the only person who stopped in his tracks at the spectacle. Many other passengers were staring in astonishment too. One man approached the lady and sheepishly asked, "Excuse me, miss, your dog?" He pointed to the mid-poop pup. According to the post, the dog owner only rolled her eyes and continued to loudly FaceTime. Some people, she bellowed with no hint of irony, are just so expletive rude. So the lady completely ignored the man who pointed out her dog. According to Steve, as soon as the dog finished its business, the woman began walking away. She didn't even attempt to clean up the doo-doo. Another spectator attempted to stop her. "You're not going to clean that up?" the onlooker asked, astonished. The woman answered, "They have people for that." Everyone stood dumbfounded at her arrogance. "I have nothing against people flying with their dogs," Steve explained in his post. "I do it often, but it's a privilege I take seriously. My dog is well trained and behaves better than most people. On top of that, LAX includes a pet relief area for this very purpose." According to Steve, this area was just 2 gates away from where the party pooper let her dog go to town. She had no excuse. There stood Steve Hofstetter, an airport crowd, and a pile of fresh dog poop. Steve said that he stood near the pile and made sure that passengers didn't walk on it. Meanwhile, another airport attendee went to fetch a maintenance worker. "No one said anything. We were so shocked that anyone could be this horrible," Steve said in his post. It was as if no one dared speak about the traumatic, ridiculous experience. After a while, the airport guests recruited an unlucky maintenance worker to clean up the pile. Steve continued to his gate, ready to put that experience behind him. You'd think that's the end of the story, right? Wrong. As Steve approached his gate, he heard the familiar dog barking and loud voice. The same woman was sitting at his gate. "Great, we're both going to Tokyo," Steve stated in his Facebook post. Steve heard the airport offender before he saw her. According to his post, her dog was loudly barking at everyone who walked by. To make matters worse, the woman was still loudly FaceTiming. This time, though, she FaceTimed without headphones on. Once her loud conversation ended, airport passengers received some relief. It lasted a moment. Then the woman began playing music with no headphones on. She acted as if no one else existed in the airport. At this point, Stephen had enough. "I don't like to throw around the word sociopath," he wrote, "but I don't know how else I could explain just how selfish and terrible of a person she was. I bet her car was somewhere in long-term parking, parked across 3 spots with paint on the bumper from the child's bike she hit without leaving a note," he joked. Except the sentiment behind it wasn't a joke. Angry and concerned, Steve invented a plan to enact vengeance on the rude woman. He wasn't going to take a 12-hour flight with her without putting her in her place at least once. "When I travel abroad, I get embarrassed by other Americans doing things 100 times less embarrassing than leaving animal feces on the floor at an airport," he wrote. He decided to repay the other airport attendees by hatching a small prank. For his plan to work, all he had to do was put on a fake accent. Steve also waited until less than an hour before the plane was scheduled to take off, just to make her day a little bit worse. According to Steve, everyone else at the gate was sitting far away from her loud DJ fest. "I am not everyone else," he wrote. He sat down next to her and initiated his plan. Once Steve sat next to the woman, he donned his best British accent. "Are you going to London on business?" he asked her. The woman looked annoyed that he interrupted her obnoxious, unfettering music. "I'm going to Tokyo," she responded gruffly, before returning to her music. "Oh," Steve replied, trying to sound confused. Then you better hurry. Your flight got moved to gate 53C. This is the flight to London. I didn't predict what would happen next, Steve wrote. He had originally intended to give her a slight panic before she realized that he was wrong. The woman snatched her bags and her dog in a huff before sprinting out of the gate. She was so self-involved, Steve wrote, that she didn't notice that the monitor at our gate still said Tokyo, and almost everyone else at the gate was Japanese. He assumed that she would recognize the mistake and return to the gate. Steve wasn't expecting the woman to trust him without a second thought. She clearly believed me, he later laughed, which made her even more of a jerk for not bothering to thank me for being nice. Steve watched the woman stomp away from her proper flight gate. Some people, he thought smugly, are just so expletive rude. But despite his intentions, Steve's revenge plans had great consequences for the woman. The real Tokyo flight boarded from gate 69A. The 53 gates were on the other side of LAX's enormous terminal. If she didn't get lost, Steve predicted that she would arrive in 15 minutes. With her dog and luggage in tow, it would likely take much longer. I felt guilty knowing she probably berated some poor clerk who had to explain to her that there was no gate 53C, Steve mentioned in his post. Not only did Steve trick the woman into running across 16 gates, but he also made up a gate that doesn't exist at LAX. At this point, Steve knew she would get lost. I figured I could give her a little moment of panic as payback for how terribly she was treating everyone, he said. At this point, there was less than 45 minutes until boarding. Steve and the other passengers could finally enjoy their wait without a barking dog or blaring music. In the peace and quiet, time passed quickly. The flight attendants began boarding the Tokyo flight, and the rude woman was nowhere to be found. Steve decided to wait a while just in case he saw her return enraged. Why wouldn't he want to see the conclusion to his epic revenge tale? Eventually, Steve was the last one to board the plane. Giving up, he told the flight attendants that he was just waiting for someone and entered the plane. Although he waited, Steve never saw any sign of the woman. I don't know if she made it back to this flight before we took off or not, he wrote on Facebook, but I didn't see her board and I don't hear her dog. It's safe to assume that the rude woman never made it onto the flight. Otherwise, Steve would have heard loud FaceTiming and music. Even today, he doesn't know how the turnaround took her over 45 minutes. Her missing her flight was not my original intention, said Steve, but it would be a fine punishment for her being so rude to everyone and making a low-paid stranger clean feces off the floor. The consequence is greater than most people think, however. What makes me wonder if I went too far is the knowledge that Delta only has one flight to Tokyo each day, Steve reported. Whoops. As with any internet story, Steve's tale met with mixed responses. Most commenters laughed along at what he did. Others feared for his flight karma, or called the story fake. One thing's for sure, Steve Hofstetter has a solid story that he can rehearse during any stand-up routine. For the first time in the story, Steve ended on a note that could help the woman. Maybe she can rebook on another airline, he wrote. I hear they have people